Thanks for the invite and thanks for the introduction. So yeah, over the past few years, I've been working on mostly what I call animal welfare economics and plant-based diet economics, but you could say vegan economics. Still, it's a question of how you name it for reactance purposes. So one of the big questions that we have in this literature, and I think a lot of people are thinking about that currently, is how to put animals in the social welfare function that we usually consider in economics. So basically, it's not only about economics, but that's in society in general. How can we include animals in choices that we make, like in terms of public policies, but also in terms of private choice. But here we'll mostly focus on the question of public policies. So very often we have those cost-benefit analyses. But so at the end of the day, we have a monetary equivalence for the cost, for the benefits, but animals are never included in these computations. So this is the major idea of the paper: is how could we have a cost-benefit analysis of policies that improve animal welfare? How can we put numbers on improvements or deterioration of animal welfare? So of course that's very challenging. There are a lot of hot topic when you need to do that. Many assumptions, but here, so the paper here is kind of a first attempt to do it. So what we know is that more and more people care about animal welfare. So I think you're all convinced about that. I really like this this figure here from the European Union, where you see that whatever the country in the European Union, you have about 90% of people who care about the welfare of farmed animals. But as you know, I mean, very little is done for them, except maybe recently you've heard last year about the end decade age initiative that was accepted by the European Union. But still, it will take time, and still it's very difficult to see to compute the monetary benefits for the improvement of animal welfare. So more broadly, I think there is a big change in perspective in our societies, Western societies, about how we see human and animal lives. So historically, we tend to think that human lives are worth much more than animal lives, and even our like simple pleasures, like maybe eating meat or going to shows where there are wild animals involved, were not questioned. But more and more people now are questioning this. And they say, okay, maybe human lives are worth the same as animal lives, or at least there are some costs for the animals of using them. And so basically, we should do some cost-benefit analysis to see whether it's worth using them. So that's somehow a very utilitarian perspective that I'm taking here, which is quite standard for the kind of welfarist approach in the animal welfare movement. So this change in view has many implications, and especially about what people ask in terms of public policies. So here I will present today French data. So just to show you what French people think about that. So 2 years ago, there was this proposal which was called Referendum for the animals, where many associations, deputies, members of the parliaments, many people supported this referendum, where they ask, for instance, mandatory access to outdoor for animal farming, the ban of animal experimentations whenever there are alternatives, ban of cage farming, ban of fur farming, ban of so the most cruel types of hunting, and ban of shows involving wild animals. So this was 2 years ago, and actually last year there was a law in France where they decided actually to ban fur farming and to ban shows involving wild animals. So the members of the parliament are quite aware of this change in preferences in the population, and they try to change the law. But still, for some issues like farming, it's very hard for them to change the legislations, because the lobbies are saying it's very costly for the industry, but what are the benefits of improving animal welfare? So as long as we don't put numbers on the benefits for improving animal welfare, that's very, animals will always lose in those cost-benefit analyses. So we know there are growing concerns in society for animal welfare. Now we have a better and better knowledge about animal cognitions. We know that most of them actually are sentient. Here we say that, consider that sentient beings are beings that have feelings, which include mammals, birds, reptiles, fish. Here I don't discuss insects, but so it's debated, but seems to be evidence that they're also sentient. But the question is still, we know that. We know they can have positive and negative experiences of the world as humans. So they have utilities as humans. They have individual utility functions. So how can we integrate them in the social welfare function? Traditionally in economics, and I think also in your fields, the discipline was very anthropocentric. So completely excluding animal welfare, also excluding their altruistic preferences towards animal welfare. So I would say in the 80s, 90s, there has been some first works in agricultural economics where economists try to compute willingness to pay for improving animal welfare. So here they tend to have an instrumental view of animal welfare. So we should maybe improve animal welfare because people are ready to pay for them. So improving animal welfare may be a way to improve human welfare at the end. However, we know that we can go one step further. Economics is mostly built on utilitarian philosophy. In utilitarianism, what we know is that what matters is to have welfare experience. To have different states of welfare, positive states of welfare, negative states of welfare. So we can rank welfare states depending on different policies, for instance. So animals should also be included in this utilitarian trade-off that we usually make for policymaking. So we should go one step further and not only considering animals for humans, but considering animals for their own sake. So here, of course, you can have different, you could integrate animal welfare at different intensity levels. We discussed that with Nicolas Trèche in a previous paper, where, you could imagine a social planner which is fully anthropocentric or who is fully anti-speciesist, depending on what's your objective and how is society today. But I think we all agree that even people who are not vegan at all, that we should at least consider a bit the welfare of animals. So there are some situations where the welfare of the animals is more important than the welfare of humans. For instance, pure act of cruelty against animals are forbidden in most societies. So which means that the pleasure that you derive from torturing an animal is not worth, compared to the decrease in utility that you impose on the animal. So there is always some kind of a cost-benefit analysis regarding animal welfare. So if you agree on that we should consider animals for their own sake, when you implement a policy that may affect animals, the change in social welfare includes, of course, the change in utility for humans, here expressed as monetary equivalence. You have to consider the cost of the policy, but also the change in animal welfare utility. So here alpha is your level of anti-speciesism, so it could be 0, you're fully speciesist social planner, but the more you care about animal welfare, so the more a policy will be the more if a policy is beneficial to an animal, the more this policy is going to be will bring more benefits for society. So the key question is, depending on how you define, of course, the welfare function, you will have different conclusions about whether a policy is worth implementing or not. So when alpha is here equal to 1, this means that you can, very theoretically, you give the same weight to animal welfare, to the change in animal welfare, and the change in human welfare. So here would be like ideal situations where, if for anti-speciesists, where you have equality of consideration for human and animals. Of course, this doesn't mean that you have they should have the same rights, as you know, but at least you give them equal consideration. Today, we consider mostly in economics alpha equals to 0. So basically, we only focus on the first part of the equation. A policy is welfare improving only if the cost of the policy is lower than what people are ready to pay for, like the change in the aggregate change in utility. But of course, Okay, we completely ignore policies that are welfare improving. People are not ready to pay much for them, for those policies, but it improves a lot animal welfare, and those policies are completely excluded so far. So the big question of the big challenge, I mean, objective of the paper is how can we evaluate this change in animal welfare utility, and how can we put numbers on that, I mean, in terms of monetary equivalence. So that's a big question. I think many people are working on this. So the starting point here, maybe it's a kind of a very intuitive for non-economists, but for economists, it was maybe not so intuitive to justify the inclusion of animal welfare. But so sentient beings, they have positive and negative experiences of the world, so they have their own utility function. So if we follow their utilitarianism tradition, we should include them in our function. But then the next question is, how can we do that? We have different species, and of course, it's very hard to measure the changes in utility for animals. So for humans, it's also a bit hard. But what we do is that we compare, for instance, the changes in the willingness to pay of humans of implementing different types of policies. So we have the monetary equivalence of changing in utility. But of course, we cannot use willingness to pay for animals. So they cannot express their changes in utility in human terms, that is, say, in monetary terms. Okay, they are outside of the market. They're not participating to the market, I mean, as a human agent and so on. So that's not possible. So there have been two steps in the literature. First, what we can do is that imagine that every single species has its own utility function, so its own spectrum of utility, what we can do is that we can try to express the utility of each animal of different species into a common welfare unit, which would be the standard welfare unit. So imagine this is a scale where you can compare individuals from very different species. Then you could say, for instance, you could compare one utility point of a human with one utility point of a hen or a cow, for instance. So to get this standard welfare unit, what others proposed, so here I cite two of them, but in economics, but there are others in other disciplines that proposed what they call the utility potential matrix. So it would mean that, okay, with this factor, which is a utility potential, you would transform the utility of one animal, okay, into this common space here, which is the standard welfare unit. So Budolfson and Spears, they propose to do the following. They say, okay, imagine that humans have a utility potential of 1. We will define different types of utility potentials. So other researchers may call this like sentience levels. So maybe animals are more sentient than others. What I say here is more that, so I like the term utility potential in the way that some animals may have a broader or smaller spectrum of emotions that they can feel, or they have a higher capacity to have positive and negative experiences of the world. Like they have more I mean, they are more conscious on some dimensions than others. So this is a way to distinguish those animals. Okay, if you think like maybe an elephant has very complex emotions, like grieving, for instance, which is so far, I mean, we don't think it's the case, for instance, for insects or for fishes. So the basic idea here is to assume that, to consider that we can sort those animals, okay, along this dimensions, which is utility potential. Yes, Michelle?
Yes, I have a question, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, because one of the, I guess, weirdest discussions that you can have sometimes with say that not be.
Sorry, Michelle, I don't know if it's me, but I cannot hear you very well.
Yeah, it's cutting off a bit.
Okay. Sorry, I will try again stopping the video. Okay. Yes, so one criticism that you often get is that if people would stop eating meat or using animals for sort of, I guess, purposes related to human consumption, these animals would not be alive in the first place.
So yeah, so it might
how
be
you think about, yeah.
Oh, sorry. So it might be true. I think we somehow have to, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, if you raise an animal and the animal has a super nice life, and even though, I mean, at the end, the animal is slaughtered, I think you created an overall positive balance of utility. So somehow you improved the social welfare. So for me, it's not, I mean, you could, of course, you could say that, I don't know, if you're abolitionist, for instance, that the fact of killing the animal at the end imposes an extremely negative utility on the animal, decreasing utility. So you could argue that, but so I'm not against this argument. So we have this paper with Nicolas, and the key question, but so here it's a challenge that I also need to integrate in this model. The key question is whether life is worth living. So this is a paper in social choice and welfare. And if you assume that the overall balance of utility is positive, then life is worth living. So you improve utility when you, social welfare when you have a new animal. Okay, here. Of course, then you have also very difficult discussions because you're comparing two states of the world and where the number of animals change. In one state of the world, there is one extra animal compared to another state of the world with one fewer animal. So it's not trivial to compare social welfare when you have, I mean, different number of individuals in population ethics. So yeah, but that's a key question that you're asking. Yeah. So I will not answer this, I mean, in detail more here. It's a big question, but that I do not really address in this paper. So one of the key questions is how to define this utility potential, which are phi of S. How can we rank those different sentient beings in terms of utility potentials? So what Baldowson and Spears propose is to use the number of neurons. I will come back to it. I have a slightly different measure, but that's maybe a good way to start. So what we can do is to decompose. So when you have a policy that affects animals in general, what it means is that it affects animals I of different species S, and different species S have different utility potentials. So if it's equal to 1, it's a human. Okay, so if an animal has a utility potential equal to 1, this means that its change in utility is worth the same as a change of utility of a human somehow. So what I do in the model, so there are different models of animal welfare. I think the one of the most famous one maybe you know about is the welfare quality. So for many reasons, I don't really like those this specific model of animal welfare. What I do here is that I start from the 5 freedom framework, which is a very conservative, I mean, or limited framework from animal welfare. Why? Mostly because it focuses on negative experiences of animals and doesn't include positive experiences of animals. So it's a very conservative framework. But the good point is that you can use this this framework for all types of animals, whatever the species, which is good. You can have a universal criterion here. You can use that for animal farming, for experiments on animals, wild animals, and so on. So what I do here is that I consider the 5 freedoms, and I look at to which extent those freedoms are violated. So either your freedom is fully fulfilled, or you have different levels of violations. Based on this, I compute the number of violations of freedoms that you have. So just to show you an example, so imagine you have a cat at home, the cat is well fed, it has outdoor access, it has medical care and so on. So, I mean, your cat is living his best life, okay? So he has all freedom fulfilled. On the contrary, so you may have different types of animals, like here the worst case that I assume is imagine you have transported animals that are left to die in trucks or in cargoes with extreme heat and suffering from dehydration, and undernutrition. So here somehow they experience thirst, distress, physical discomfort, pain, they cannot express their natural behaviors in those extremely dense cargos. So here is the world that you can imagine. So here I define the scales, and so it's what I do is something very similar to QALY. So what you do with QALY, so mostly in economics, is you have to define the score 1 is when you have 1 year in perfect health. And then you have to define at what point your life becomes worse than being dead. Somehow it's at what point your life is not worth living anymore. So I do the same here as in QALY. The only change here is that usually in QALY, we define death equivalent by asking people, okay? Changes on this scale here is done by asking people, like they have to present them fiction scenarios, and they have to say what's their utility loss and so on. Here, what I do is that I say that if animals, so out of those 20 possible violations points, if animals have severe violations of all their freedoms, okay, I say that then death is preferable to being alive in those situations. So it's subject to discussion, of course, but so that's a starting point here. So what you can do is that you can evaluate the position of an animal before policy and after policy. And what you do is that you evaluate the change in welfare status of these animals, so before and after here. Then you obtain the following. So the change in welfare of an animal is defined by its utility potential. So this is how to transform the utility of one species into this common metric, which is the standard welfare unit. Then you have these changes in welfare, okay, on the previous scale I just showed you. And then I introduce this scaling parameter here, Q. So this scaling parameter helps transforming this standard welfare units into monetary equivalents. So how I propose to do that is the following. So imagine you have a human here. So by definition, the utility potential is 1. Imagine you compare an additional, the human when the human is alive, with everything is going perfect, and a situation where the human loses 1 year of life. Okay, so this is equal to 1 based on the previous definition. So then the change in welfare when a human loses 1 year of life is Q. And Q, what I say is that it's the definition of your 1 unit of QALY. So in this model, I calibrate Q as the monetary equivalent of 1 unit of QALY, which is in France, to tell you, so it's about, it depends on the estimates, but what I take here is 140,000 euros for 1 year of life for a human. So we have this Q, we have here this change in welfare. The remaining question here is a phi of S.
Romain, sorry, yeah. Could you say just briefly where this number comes from? Because you said an estimate.
Oh yeah, so I just took papers from health economics where they estimate that. I don't remember exactly which one, but one of the issue, of course, is that it's country dependent. So it's an issue somehow, because it would mean that the life of an animal depends on the country the animal is in. But actually, that's not a big deal, because the measure that you have here is to do a cost-benefit analysis. So of course, you compare what humans are ready to pay for their own life in the country and versus what they're ready to pay for animals in that country. So here it's not absolute numbers, it's mostly for cost-benefit analysis.
And it's something that relates to willingness to pay for medical treatments and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
It's hypothetical willingness to pay. Yeah. So a big question is how to construct this this utility potential. So what Buildafson and Spears they propose to do is they have this parametric form of to compute their utility potentials. So they take the number of neurons here of species S divided by the number of neurons of humans, and they have this exponential parameter which is psi here. So their idea is the following. So of course they are not interested in the number of neurons per se, but what they say is that higher, animals that have higher, that have more complex emotions, okay, they need higher levels of cognitions because you need to treat more information and to generate more complex emotions. So those higher level of cognitions, so to have higher levels of cognitions, you need more neurons. So they use the number of neurons as a proxy for cognition, and cognition itself is a proxy for having more complex emotions. So here they argue it's a good proxy. Somehow, when I talk with animal welfare scientists, they say it's not that bad. The worst you can do here is to have brain size, because it depends a lot on the size of the animal and different stuff. So number of neurons is not bad. What I do here is that I consider the number of neurons in specific parts of the brain, which is the cortex for mammals and the pallium for birds. So it's I think it's slightly better because it correlates quite well with cognitive skills. The only issue I would like to mention is that there are some animals that are not at all following these rules, like more neurons is associated with a higher cognition. And so there are some exceptions, but overall, you see a good correlations between number of neurons and cognition scores. Another questions I don't talk about here is how you measure cognition, because we have a very human-based approach of cognition, so that's not for today. So then what I do here, I take the same parametric form as they do. The only question is how you can define this psi here, and it's essential because it has a big impact on how you compute utility potentials. So what I do is that so for economics, I take the second derivative and I look at what it means to have psi below 1 equal to 1 or above 1. So if the psi here is below 1, this means that the first neurons that you have helps you a lot in getting more, in having a better cognition. And then you have decreasing returns. So the additional neuron that you have is less worthy than the previous one. On the contrary, if you have psi larger than 1, this means that an additional neuron is going to be more than the previous one in terms of cognition. So my assumption here, so we will never know, this psi, even if the parametric form is good. What I say is that you can reach high sentience. You can reach sentience with very few neurons. For instance, it's the case for fishes. For fish, it's the case for insects, for instance. So what I argue here is that psi should be lower than 1. And what I do is that, so to be the most conservative, I take psi close to 1, and I show you it. So it has big impact. Okay, so here are the utility potentials I told you about. So humans have utility potentials of 1, and then depending on which psi you take, okay, you have a very sharp decrease in the utility potentials of other animals. So here I show you for baboons, hens, cats, pigs. Okay. For instance, when psi is equal to 1, this means that the utility potential of 1 human is equal to the utility potential of 8 baboons, almost. So you could say that 1 year of life of human has the same monetary, economic benefits as 8.2 lives of years of life of baboons. Okay. So of course, something that's a bit disturbing sometimes for it's that with sentience, we decided to create somehow a dichotomy between sentient beings and non-sentient beings, saying we don't have this hierarchy anymore between humans and others. And what we do here is that we introduce a hierarchy between animals, so among sentient beings. So that's an issue many people have, but I think it's kind of so maybe it's a wrong intuition, but I think elephants, for instance, have not the same experience of the world as ants, for instance, and this is a way to take that into account. So, but of course, that's subject to debate. Okay, so then I'm going for the application. So if you have questions, feel free. Yes, Michelle.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I guess it's almost like indeed a kind of philosophical question, but I'm just thinking, even if you think about within humans, which is maybe where we are most comfortable thinking about, So I'm not sure about the number of neurons and the heterogeneity in the number of neurons across humans, but I can see how we are really quickly getting into a slippery slope if we start thinking about, I don't know, maybe more sensitive humans should weigh more in the social welfare function than those who are more, I don't know, mentally stable or something like that. And then extrapolating this to animals.
We lost you, Michelle, at the end. Stefan, can you hear Michelle? Or?
No, I cannot hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Michelle, sorry, we lost you when you were relating to animals, then your argument.
Sorry. Yeah. So I just think that indeed extrapolating from to animals raise more questions as well. So are we sort of thinking about more sensitive species to be weighing more?
So sorry, Michelle. So I think I understood your question. So I mean, that's the first part. So I think so. Two things. First, there is a very interspecies variance is quite large, but the intraspecies variance is very small in terms of neurons. So this means that there are the differences within each species is negligible. So there, I mean, if you look in terms of utility potential, the difference is so small that I mean it has no impact. So you can be if it can helps with your concerns on this. But then, I mean, the question is, we can always define the social welfare function saying that we refuse to make intraspecies comparisons between individuals, but we are okay to make it between species. I mean, the social welfare function, basically, it's it's an arbitrary decision. For instance, we decide to not to include antisocial preferences in the social welfare function. We do not take into account racist preferences, homophobic preferences, and so on. So we can say, okay, so we don't take, we assume that all people in the welfare function receive the same weight, moral weight, whatever, I mean, within each species. So for me, it's not a big question. So even in society, deciding that all individuals are equal, it's not, maybe it's not true in terms of biology, because they're people with more or less abilities, but still we decide that in terms of moral values, all individuals are equal. So I think we can do the same here. What we know also, so we don't discuss that here, but so what this is also something that Broom recalls is that sentience can be acquired over time. So when you're a fetus, you're not sentient, but then you become sentient. And then sentience can also be lost, okay? For instance, if you have an accident and then you lose consciousness and so on, so you can also lose sentience. So why not having different, so some people call that sentience intensities. I don't like it because I prefer to have it, so I talked with some philosophers about that. Some of them, I like the idea is saying that sentience is a binary concept. You're sentient or not. And then within insentient individuals, you may have different intensities for experiencing the world. So UT potential is for this intensity. Very stimulating. So thank you, Michelle. That's a lot of comments. I mean, yeah. So then what I try to do is how to apply this framework. So 2 years ago, it's getting old, but 2 years ago, I conducted a project with a bunch of students, which was called 20 Policies for the Animals. What we did is that we contacted about 40 NGOs, and we gathered all their proposals for improving animal welfare. So in total, I mean, the students, they gathered about 200 policy proposals. We selected the ones that they thought were the most important, maybe the most popular in society. I mean, in terms of they could be adopted. Then the students, they worked on those proposals, and they made a public project which was called so 20 Policies for the Animals. And a lot of people actually joined the project, like 15 parliament members, 18,000 French citizens, 20 NGOs, and so on. So I mean, many researchers, they signed the proposals asking for the parliament to implement those policies. So then, so there were 2 policies per topic. So we discussed for pets, a lot of so farming, so animal experimentation, education, like having plant-based menus at schools or having animal ethics classes, policies for pets, like sterilization campaigns for cats, or having first visit free at the vet for identification, questions about fur sailing, labeling for eggs, shows, okay, subsidies for circuses, prohibition of shows involving dolphins or killer whales, and then a lot of, many policies for about farming. So either it's prohibiting farm factory, for instance, but also very different one, like prohibiting forced feeding for ducks, for instance, for foie gras production and so on. So in total, we have those 20 policies which were covering a lot of different topics, also including hunting. Okay. And so what we did is that we elicited the willingness to pay for those policies, and so I will show you, the objective is to show you what people are ready to pay for those policies, and then what are the gains for animal welfare. Okay, so basically what I try to do here, what I will show you is that I will compute how much people are ready to pay for those policies, and how animals could be impacted with those policies based on the model I just presented. And we will compare whether the correlation between what people are ready to pay for and the impact on animal welfare. So we had a survey, a very standard survey in terms of willingness to pay, except that maybe we had many different types of policies. So we told people that the policies were to be implemented for 5 years, paid by an increase in taxes every year. We asked them to be realistic in terms of their impact on their budget. And we asked them how much are you ready to pay at most for the implementation of these policies, so funded by increasing taxes. So we also asked people whether they were confident or not, and if they opposed, if they reported that they were not willing to pay for the policies, we asked them actually why they were not ready to pay for it. So yeah, basically that's it, and we randomized all policies. So we had a representative sample of the French population in March 2020. And so this is, I don't talk about too much about the econometric details, but this is so the average willingness to pay that we find in France. So this is what the average French guy or girl is ready to pay each year for the implementation of those policies. So it's not too far from from what you can find, for instance, for farmed animals, in terms of willingness to pay. So it's it's not the smallest willingness to pay I've seen. It's not the largest either. So it's in between. So what we see is that there are important differences in terms of between policies. So the largest one is mandatory stoning before slaughter, which is not surprising. It's a very popular policy in France. Especially because of for extreme right parties, because it targets Muslim mostly, but still it's kind of consistent with what we observe in public pools. The least popular policy is ban on forced feeding for foie gras, because French people love foie gras, and so they are not willing to ban forced feeding because it would decrease a lot the production, and I think it's mandatory to get foie gras label to have on forced feeding. So then you have various types of support for those policies. And what is also not very popular in France, I will show you more data, is plant-based menus at school. So every year we have a big debate about that. So important thing is that we try to get rid of warm glow. So what we know is that there are some people tend to over-report their willingness to pay. So once you control for that, so to get more conservative estimates, and I think it's more coherent. So people are ready to pay. I mean, once you get rid of the warm glow of giving for animals, the average willingness to pay is about half of what I just presented you. So here, same thing as before. I mean, the ordering is not very impacted. The mandatory stunning is the most popular policy among French people, and the ban on force feeding is the least popular policy. So anyway, we have a heterogeneity in the willingness to pay based on those policies. Then when so here, what you have in dark blue, it's the share of people who are willing to pay for the policy. So we know that they have a positive utility from those policies. So the change in utility is positive. Then we have all people who report zeros. When we look at their answers, we distinguish three types of people. People who are somehow free riding. They say, okay, I support the policy, but I don't want to be the one to pay for it. So they still enjoy the policy, they support it, but they don't want to pay. You have people who just don't care about that. And they tell you, okay, so I don't care about those animals, or I don't really care about the situation. And there are people who have a negative utility. So basically those people, they would have a negative experience with the policy implementation. So mostly the two most important topics is introduction of plant-based menus at school, because people want to keep eating meat, so they're not ready to pay to eat less meat. The ban on force feeding, of course, because it would reduce the amount of foie gras that is available. So here also you have a strong heterogeneity, and for some policies, for three of them, there are less than 50% of the population who is willing to pay. So when you look at the numbers here, they are quite large willingness to pay, but those are averages. And actually, you have really two groups of people: a group of people who is ready to pay, and a group of people who just don't really care. Okay, so mostly because either the free ride or they have zero utility. People who really oppose the policies, it's small share. Okay, it's usually less. For most of them, less than 10%. So anyway, so that's detailed. That's some robustness check. But then we can compute the social gains, okay, per citizen. So what people are ready to means the social gains of implementing the policy. If you look only at humans, okay, so this is what maybe cost-benefit analysis do today. But then if you use the model I introduced above, you obtain this. So be careful here, it's in log scale. So this is the average gain. Be careful. So the average gain in utility. So the average gain, sorry, of animal welfare per human citizen. Okay. So here I always divide everything by human citizen. So number of human citizens is constant, but here you have to changes in animal welfare. So what I did is that I went through all single policies, which was a very intense. And I computed the cost using the method I proposed. Okay, I'll show you an example. So here, for instance, policy number 6 is the making the first visit to a vet free and compulsory to identify pets. So I retrieved data about how many animals are lost each year. Okay, so we know that about 80,000 dogs and cats are lost every year. Less than half of them are actually eventually found. So we know that about for 40,000 of them, they are completely lost, and 40,000 of them they are found and they go back to their owner. So I say that lost animals whose owner is not found suffer on average from severe violations for fear, distress, from the very fact of losing their owner. And okay, maybe the violation is a bit lower when the owner is found again, so they go back to the owner. Because the stress is lower because they go back to their family. I assume moderate violations for hunger and thirst. A lot of them that animals are abundant in the wild, so they die from hunger or thirst, dehydration. Physical discomfort, pain, and injury, okay, for animals whose owner are not found. And so we know that a lot of them, they go wild, or they die, or they are euthanized by associations. So here I decompose, okay, I have the number of animals, the category of animals, the number of avoided violation points. So I'm just, for each policy, I report whether the level of confidence I have in my computations. So this is how to do it. So based on doing that for all cases, this is what we obtain. So as you can see, there are very, very heterogeneous gains in terms of policies. And actually, it's not surprising. For instance, for dolphin shows, the gains are very, very small. Okay, so on average, banning dolphin shows in France will bring about 1 cent, okay, of euro per human. Okay, why is that the case? Because there were only like 15 dolphins in France. So there is a very small number of dolphins in France, and the policy will impact a very small number of animals. But on the contrary, banning intensive farming in France, it has a huge impact because, I mean, about, I don't remember, it maybe something about 700,000 animals in France are farmed without outdoor access. Okay, so it has a very, very huge impact. But what we observe, of course, is that here, when you compare ban on intensive farming, okay, 25 euros on average of willingness to pay, and dolphin shows 26. So you have almost the same willingness to pay. Humans are ready to pay almost the same thing for the two policies, while they have very different impacts for animals. So I think it's not something surprising. There are some works, you know, about the scope and sensitivity. So people are ready to pay about the same for saving 100 cats and 2,000 cats, for instance. So it's kind of the same thinking here. Maybe there is a great share of one globe, but maybe there is something more than that. Maybe people they cannot really think about huge numbers. And for instance, for the numbers of animals which are in intensive farms. So of course, in the willingness to pay questionnaire, we told them how many animals are concerned, but still we have those results. So here, so it's in log scale. So you go from 1 cent to 3.6 thousand euros for an improvement of the animal welfare per human. Then you have very different impacts. Like for circuses, also there are maybe a few hundreds animals that are in circuses in France, so they would be concerned by the policy. You have more people, animals which are in farm for their fur, for instance. And also what you have here is like for ban on force feeding, it has a large impact because animals, they suffer a lot from force feeding, and there are many ducks which are concerned. Okay, so very large heterogeneity. So the last thing I do is to compare the ranks in terms of what humans are ready to pay for, in terms of what would be the benefits for animal welfare. So here on the left-hand side, you have more effective policies for improving, so either human or animal welfare. And here you have less effective policies. So what I do here is that I compare the rank in terms of the impact for humans in terms of altruism, and the impact on animals for their own sake. Okay, so in blue you have the rank of the policy in terms of human welfare. So the most welfare improving policy is mandatory stunning before slaughtering. The least popular policy, okay, is the ban on force feeding for humans. And in yellow you have the rank of the impact of policies in terms of animal welfare. So the most, as I just presented, the most effective one is the ban on intensive farming, and the least effective one is like the ban on cage rearing shows. So here you have policies that are more effective for animals than for humans. Okay, ban on cage rearing for hens is more effective so it improves more the welfare. So it has it's very important for hens, but it's lower ranked for humans in terms of willingness to pay. And here it's the contrary. Okay, like circuses for conversion, so banning the wild animals in circuses. It's very well valued for humans, but not that much for animals because only a few of them are concerned. What we see here is that there is no correlation between what humans are ready to pay for and the effective impact on animals. So humans, they tend to pay a lot sometimes for policies which are completely ineffective for animals, like what do we have? Like circuses, like dolphin shows, for instance, or banning wild animals in circuses. It has very small impact on animals, but people are ready to pay a lot for that. So and when you look at public policies, this is exactly what happened. Last year, they passed a law to ban dolphin shows, and wild animals in circuses. But that's humans who are valuing that a lot, but animals, it's very ineffective for them. On the contrary, the most important topics currently to improve animal welfare, like ban on intensive farming, ban on force feeding, ban on cage rearing, they were not at all discussed by policymakers. People are ready to pay much less for them compared to their impact on animals. Yes, Michelle.
I will try. If it doesn't work, I type it. But so I guess coming back to the earlier point, so if you think about, say, for example, the ban on indoor, just purely indoor raised animals, what you're doing is that you're thinking, okay, so if they were indeed, if that was banned, all these animals would then now be outside. And I'm worried that the truth is that most of these animals would just not exist at all. And so then, that's
so it's a good question. You could say that there is a decrease, for instance, in consumption if you ban that, if you ban this type of practice. So I don't know, like you could look at the elasticity with respect to prices, and then you have you have an estimate of the change in prices due to the better rearing conditions, and then you estimate the decrease in meat consumption, for instance, associated with the increase in price. If this is what you have in mind.
Yes, I'm just worried that if we would have this calculation and say, okay, we're going to have a lot less animals actually alive, we might in fact get a calculation that shows us that this is actually not so positive. You see what I mean?
Yeah. So there are two ways of doing it. So either you say, so when you compare social welfare, so either you have this kind of a critical utilitarianism approach where you say, whenever they have a positive, positive overall utility in their lives, bringing them will improve to life will improve your social welfare. So what you say is that if they do not exist, you reduce social welfare. Another way, another strain of social welfare literature says that you cannot compare situations where some individuals exist in one situation and do not exist in another situation. So here you could either, you could also say, okay, I consider only the change of welfare for animals that remain alive under both scenarios. Okay, so there are both solutions in the literature. I don't discuss too much this here. What I'm mostly focused here is the tool to evaluate animal welfare for. The most conservative way is to say, okay, for animals that are living under both situations, how can we evaluate the change in welfare?
And couldn't you incorporate something that takes into account their length of life, which might then partially solve that problem?
Okay, so that's a good question. So I'll discuss that a bit. So first, length of life strongly correlates with the number of cortical neurons. So it's like elephants have much longer lives than fish, for example. So it's indirectly introduced. So the big question. So, but here again. So imagine that you have a hen that is living in like 90 days, for instance. So is it a loss of welfare or not? The fact that it could have lived maybe twice longer or 3 times longer or whatever. I mean, here you're comparing the days that are not lived with days that could be lived. I mean, so it's the same point. I mean, it's the same as comparing animals that exist and animals that do not exist under 2 different types of scenarios. So it's a big question on what we see when we look at people's maybe preferences is that they prefer to have animals that, when animals are in intensive farms, they say it's better for them to die quickly because otherwise their life is worse and worse. So if you think that you have increasing costs in living in intensive farming, it's better to have short-lived animals. But that's the question. So if you want to be, ideally, you want a balance of utility for an animal for its entire life. So you would like to have, at each moment in its life, its welfare status, and then to have the integral over its entire life. Okay. which what some indicators do, like you could have the welfare quality indicator looking at what happens in the first flight of ants, for instance, when they are in the for the first few days they spent in those nursery, and then you have the life at the farm, and then you have the life at the slaughterhouse. So when you could integrate all those elements together. But still, you would have the big question that you're asking, how you take into account the fact that they could have lived longer, but they didn't. So it's a big question. Yeah. So if you're, I mean, it's the same. We have the same question for population ethic. If you're sure that someone would have lived, okay, you can say, okay, it's a pure loss of utility. But for instance, how do you value the fact that women may abort of children that could have lived? Do you value that or not? So what they say is that you cannot compare the two situations because it's non-existent in one scenario and it's existing in the other one. So it's not specific to animal welfare. You have the same for abortion, for instance. So I think the big point here that my paper does is to show that it's super important to consider the welfare of animals for their own sake and not only through altruistic preferences, because we see that there is a huge gap between what people are willing to pay and the effective impact it has on animals. So if we have this utilitarian approach, so it's important to have the willingness to pay because there may be some situations where people are ready to pay for that. It's not costly at all for society, and then it improves animal welfare, so everyone is winning. But then there are situations where maybe people are not ready to pay up to the cost of implementation for the policy. So I don't know, like people are ready to pay about 15 euros on average, but the policy costs about 20 euros on average per citizen. So here, how can we say that policy is globally improving social welfare? Yes, Stefan.
Oh, you are not looking at cost at all here, no?
No.
I mean, so just to, I mean, I was maybe as an economist, that's kind of my natural reaction then to wonder, if the willingness to pay is such and such, I mean, how many of these policies can I actually fund? How many animals can I kind of get out of their current state into a better state and so forth? But this is not of interest to you at this point, right? Let's say in this project.
My perspective is that economists know very well how to compute cost for humans. But so here what I try to do is to compute benefits or costs for animals. Yeah, you're right. So
right.
It would be like I think it's important for policymakers, but not for the paper here. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And you were in the beginning, you were introducing different ways of looking at animal welfare. So the slide that we currently see is basically making the point that different perspectives can be very different in terms of the ranking, right? So the blue ranking, the willingness to pay of humans for animal welfare, that would be one way of deriving a number for animal welfare, right? That was one of the perspectives one could take. So here you basically show that it's not very well aligned with a perspective, I think, that on your graph early was further down the line.
Yeah, so the point is that, so very often people say, okay, the welfare of animals is indirectly taken into account through the willingness to pay of people. So we have indirect measure, so it's good. And here what I say is that no, the indirect measure may very badly correlate with the effective impact on animals. So we need numbers for animal welfare that are distinct from the willingness to pay of humans. So this is the main point here.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to wrap up, and then there will be, I think, more time for discussion.
Okay, so maybe a few points, but so there are a lot of assumptions in this model. So I check whether the results are robust. What's important is that the ranking of policies is quite stable. So first, a big question in this literature is, at one point you say that life is worth living or not, depending on the welfare of animals. So I make some changes, and I think it's quite, the ranking is quite stable. Second question is about this parameter in the utility potential function. Here you have, it affects a lot the ranking of it. The computations of the benefits because it affects the ranking of animals between them. Then a few points here. I take cortical and Palliant neurons, which is also kind of issue. What we would like ideally is to have a proxy for the potential for complex emotions for animals. So far I took the best proxy I found, but with new data, maybe you could do something different. Especially Biersch published a paper last year, I think, about the profiles of consciousness. So it could be another way of directly measuring the capacity for feelings or emotions rather than using a proxy. We talked a bit about longevity. So a big challenge, of course, I didn't discuss here is when you have the indirect consequences of animal welfare. So I didn't talk too much about that, but if you, for instance, you restrict the possibility of hunting, I don't like for foxes, for instance, so you have fewer you have more foxes alive, and those foxes, they are going to eat other animals, so which will decrease the welfare of other animals of prey. So the indirect consequences may be negative or not. So here I limited to first order consequences, but you could think about second or third order consequences using the model as well. And just one last slide about negative willingness to pay. So here in my questionnaire, I only allowed people to report positive willingness to pay. But as I showed you, when people could explain why they put zero, some of them said that they were actually opposing the policies. So I made another treatment where, I went online with gathering new data and I asked people, so I allowed them to put negative numbers, okay? How much they are willing to pay to oppose those policies. So my question was whether it's a big topic for animal welfare, whether people are really so motivated against those policies that they're willing to pay against it. So I took the two most popular policies in what I found, the two least populars, and I took also something about animal experimentation and pets. What I found is that for most of the policies, you have very few negative willingness to pay compared to positive willingness to pay. And actually a lot of people for animal welfare, they just don't really care. They're not ready to pay for that. They don't really care for those policies. So it's a big question. And one of my next projects is how to decompose this willingness to pay, especially when people are against some policies. Is it because they think like for ban and force feeding, it's because they anticipate, for instance, decrease in the supply for foie gras, for instance. So how to control for that? So many different issues. And for instance, for shows like in France, we have those corrida. So I don't know the term in English. Sorry, where you have animals in the arena and you kill them. So the question here is whether people have like sadistic preferences, so they or not. So if they have sadistic preferences, so they like to see the animals suffer, maybe they want to oppose policies that could ban those type of practices, or maybe they enjoy the show somehow, but they don't really enjoy the suffering of the animal itself. So it's a big challenge of decomposing those willingness to pay of humans. So I think I'm done with the presentation. So just small wrap up of the model, but I'm very glad I'm open to questions now.
All right, thanks so much. I thought it was very interesting and stimulating just to raise the questions that this project raises. I mean, I have to admit that I haven't been thinking much about this beforehand, but just, I mean, the breadth of also kind of economic, but also philosophical questions that this raises, I think is enormous. And kind of at the end, if you permit me to just kind of step in here with a comment or question as well. You are calculating, so you had this picture with the ranking, so the human ranking, and then there was a ranking based on your calculation of the animal welfare.
Yeah.
And to some extent, would there be, I'm thinking of policies that even, you mentioned that you not have indirect effects. You also don't have indirect effects on humans, right? So for example, some policies might save some people some heart attacks, and that is not being accounted for, right? So if, I mean, I don't know if it makes sense, but would a full analysis combine animal welfare and then the human welfare as to what the effect would be from all these policies? Like, do you think that would be a useful step even further in order to evaluate these policies?
So completely agree. So what I said here is somehow big K is economic costs, and what you could say is that increasing prices somehow induces economic cost. But so what we want to do is to distinguish, so in the willingness to pay of people, so some people may anticipate, for instance, the increase in prices, some other may not. So what you want is to have to distinguish between what is the market impact, okay, like what's the loss of utility to the increase in prices or the reduction in supply, for instance, and what is due to the altruistic parts of humans' willingness to pay. So for instance, here I have overall willingness to pay. So I told you, like people may oppose, I don't know, like the end of dolphin shows because they like going to dolphin shows. So I may know they will not be able to do so later on. So here, but somehow for me, it's economic impact. So they have loss of a decrease in supply, but maybe some of them, they're happy to help the dolphins. So how can you estimate the altruistic impact controlling for the selfish interest, which might go through increase in prices or shortening of supply? So that would give the entire picture here if you can distinguish between the two. That's a big challenge.
Yes, yeah. So it's not at all meant as a criticism, rather than looking for the completion of this very big picture.
Yeah.
Right. I was wondering, is there other questions from the audience?
Okay, there is Alize. Do you think something might change people's willingness to pay to be more in line with effective impact on animal welfare? Oh, that's a good question. Whether we can, if I understand correctly, whether we can align people's willingness to pay with the true impact on animals. That's, I didn't think about that. I think it's very important for effective altruism, for instance, to make people aware of the real impact of what they do. What's a bit kind of a pessimistic here is that in the questionnaire for willingness to pay, we tell them exactly what types of animals and how many animals are concerned by each policy and how it could improve their welfare. So they have all the numbers. So maybe the people are kind of bad at extrapolating from that and computing the impact on animal welfare. That's a good question. I think it's a bit beyond the scope of the paper, but so except if you use at the end those, so if you have a feedback, giving them those numbers and looking at then how it impacts their willingness to pay could be a good question. Yeah. I hope I answered your comment, Alize. So Patrick, this is related to other questions, but how do you take into account the cost of climate change and all the burden on health systems? That is to say the potential saving as opposed to taxes. So yeah, so good. So that's a fair question. So here, my easier answer is that I say that, so here is everything that is related to human. So here even the change in utility, so I just ask people willingness to pay. So that's somehow a black box here. Ideally, what I would like to distinguish here is the selfish versus the altruistic concerns of humans. So in changing in the utility. But here I said that's the economic cost of the policy. So for health systems or you can quantify the cost of increased or decreased, cost for the health, in terms of health, for like increasing or reducing the consumption of red meat, for instance, when you go with plant-based menus. For climate change, so climate change is complex because you will have an impact on humans and it will have an impact on animals. So the economic cost on humans, we know how to quantify that a bit. So I don't know, like if you're focusing on plant-based menus, then you could looking at the change in the consumption of meat, then the change in greenhouse gas emissions. When you say that 1 ton of CO2 equivalent emission is about 200 euros, and then you can compute that. So it's economic question here that you can include in the big K. So for me, really the missing part in the cost-benefit analysis was this change in animal welfare. And the objective of the paper and the model is to open this black box here. But you're right. I hope I answered your comment, Patrick. So Emilia, a somewhat basic question from non-economists. You mentioned at the start that the social welfare tradition you are working with is usually aligned with the analytic and utilitarian tradition. Is there any scope for continental philosophy version of this type of economics? Certainly, as humanities persons, this number of neurons, etc., to determine sentience and value seems something that one should be skeptical of in terms of resisting simply redrawing the lines. That's a super good question. Yeah, the utilitarian philosophy is very, as you say, it's Anglo-Saxon philosophy mostly. So as I think most of people in this literature were mostly influenced by just the works of Bentham and more recently the work of Peter Singer. So good question. So when I talk with colleagues in philosophy here in France, they are mostly, they're not very utilitarian here. So it's quite difficult to have this type of reasoning in France. True. And so this is why people are, as you mentioned, are skeptical about redrawing this line between animals. So just a comment, it's not really drawing a line between animals who matter and those who do not matter. But it's giving different weights. But here I would like to insist, so the objective is not to have different moral rates on animals. It's to have different weights based on the capacities to experience the world. Okay, to give at the end is I want that one point of utility from animal A is given the same consideration as one point of utility of animal B. It's just that they have different needs, and they also have different. There are some that experience the world in a more intensive way than others. Okay. So it's the kind of equality of consideration, but it's not the equality of situation, basically. So I think it's kind of more aligned with Singer's view. Yeah. I hope I answered a bit, Emilia, but so maybe I'm more limited here. Yeah, tough question. I agree. That's good. That's good for me.
Yeah, all right. I think that was very interesting questions as well. And I think we can leave it at that. Maybe my last question would be where this project is currently. Do you currently work on a paper of that?
So I have a paper. It's also on SSRN, so you can access. So I think this paper is done, but there are much more work to do here. So we're working on developments with other colleagues, like also with Nicolas. And so because you could use that, for instance, to compute taxes for animal welfare in the meat industry, for instance. So there are many limitations to this first model, and I would also like to go and to have more details, so like better models than the 5 freedoms. So I would like to use now the 5 domains rather than 5 freedoms, which is a bit more complex. And also, I would like maybe to define some axiomatic that are, important for the scales for measuring animal welfare and so on. So yeah, there are a lot of works to do here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as I said, I think this, as it is, and just raising the question and putting out the challenge, I find, it's very involved, and but at the same time, I find also very stimulating to think about, and to, because to some extent, I guess if you want to translate these policies into the real, and talk about these policies, it's inevitable to talk about cost and welfare and so forth. So one has to start somewhere, and I think it seems it's great to try to make progress in order to, to kind of translate these notions into the kind of notion, as you said at some point in health economics, you put numbers to years of your life, and in insurances you will hear, how much an arm can be compensated for, and so forth. And these things they feel very artificial, but I guess given our current way of doing and implementing policies, that's the route that it has to take. So yeah, I think it's very interesting, very challenging, and yeah, I thought it was a very, very interesting talk. Therefore, so thanks a lot for doing this, for coming and presenting this. And yeah, I'm curious to see where this project goes, and yeah, I'm sure there are some very interesting developments coming up.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks everyone for the questions.
Yeah, and